To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, go to gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. Sugar. It's undeniably delicious, and it's what keeps your dentists in business. And, like potatoes, it's had an outsized impact on world history. Now, I'm not just talking about Oreos and Pixie Sticks either, because humanity's relationship with the sugarcane industry goes back 10,000 years. As processed sugar spread around the world, it transformed not just trade, but entire civilizations. Except, this history wasn't always sweet, and people's greed for profit came at a high human cost. Hi, I'm Rob Fuller, and this is Study Hall Modern World History. As with other spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, sugarcane likely originated in Southeast Asia. Its exact origins are complicated because there are a lot of types of sugarcane, including some that aren't edible but can be used for fencing and rooftops, and I hope their results are sturdier than the gingerbread houses I typically build. But for this episode, we're going to focus on the tasty versions. Of course, people had been eating other forms of sugar like fruit and honey for millions of years. But sugarcane was a whole new deal. And as for its origin, some historians point to the islands of Celebes and Halmahera in what's now called Indonesia, while others point to the Cook Swamp in Papua New Guinea. Now, regardless of which region can put original home of sugarcane on their welcome sign, historians agree that people started cultivating this plant around 10,000 years ago, so 8,000 BCE, give or take a few centuries. After that, Polynesian wayfarers brought it to mainland Asia, at which point it spread to China and India. And by the time it appeared in Greek and Byzantine writings, it was known as an Indian luxury. We also know that by 996, Venice was purchasing sugar from Arabic merchants and exporting it too. And in Europe, the demand really skyrocketed during the Crusades, starting in 1096. Many Europeans left for the Crusades and came back obsessed with the taste, which, fair. So Europeans started setting up trade networks to import sugar and started figuring out how to grow sugarcane and make sugar themselves. But when sugar arrived on the scene, it wasn't just used in tasty sweets, but even medicine. Sugar was mixed into syrups, juleps, powders, and ointments, and so when Mary Poppins told us that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, she was really just quoting these guys. Not because sugar actually is a catch-all remedy, but because we're always learning more in science and medicine, and a lot of things have been incorrectly thought of as medicine. However, if your mom swears by Vicks Vapor Rub, well, she's correct. It does cure everything. Now, to be fair, it wasn't like nobody realized cane sugar was delicious. For instance, sugar from sugarcane was also used in Persia to make sweetmeats. But when it comes to sugarcane, the reason there wasn't a 12th century Willy Wonka setting up shop in Europe is because sugarcane is extremely hard to grow in non-tropical climates. It requires at least a meter of rain a year and temperatures above 21 degrees Celsius year-round. Persia was able to cultivate sugarcane for a while, but production fell off after the destruction of dams following the Mongol invasion, and it was absolutely out of the question for much of Europe. And this made this type of sugar rare and, by extension, expensive. Only the wealthy could afford it, so for years, sugar remained a novelty more than anything, both as a treat and as medicine. Still, the fact that sugar was valuable meant it wouldn't remain a novelty forever. If there was money to be made, people would be sure to find ways to profit. And that brings us to the Mediterranean. By the 13th century, the Islamic caliphates that ruled territories in this region were setting up sugar plantations, despite the fact that the Mediterranean also isn't a great place to grow sugar. In some cases, the weather was too cold, and in others, there just wasn't enough water. So these plantations needed laborers to work the soil and babysit these finicky plants. And this is where sugar's history starts to turn sour. Farmers in the caliphates enslaved people to do the hard labor of planting, caring for, and harvesting sugarcane in the Mediterranean. And while Islamic laws set standards for the treatment of enslaved people, they weren't always followed. Still, the demand for sugar continued to grow and spread throughout Europe. By the 13th and 14th centuries, they'd begun to set up their own sugar plantations on Mediterranean islands, copying the methods used by the Islamic caliphates, including profiting off the labor of enslaved people who were smuggled from the Black Sea region of Asia. But it's not like the climate had changed. The Mediterranean islands that Venice controlled were still only mediocre for growing sugar. So these operations were only ever mildly profitable. To really see how sugarcane took over the world, let's head over to Portugal. Beginning in the 1420s, while other Europeans were struggling with their Mediterranean sugar operations, Portugal conquered a series of archipelagos in the Atlantic Ocean, including the Canary Islands. And those islands happened to have subtropical climates nearly perfect for growing sugar, which Portugal was quick to take advantage of. And ultimately, their sugar plantations served as a model for how to get rich growing the stuff, a model that would later spread beyond the eastern Atlantic. But Portugal was never able to fully control those territories or the Guanches, the indigenous peoples who lived there. And around 60 years later, in 1479, Spain took control of the Canary Islands from Portugal and copied their model of plantation farming. Spanish efforts to enslave, deport, and even kill the Guanches were so thorough that even today it's considered a genocide. And less than 20 years later, when Columbus arrived in tropical Hispaniola, or present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, he continued to spread the plantation method of sugar farming centered around the enslavement and forced labor of indigenous people, like the Taino. And in the 1600s, Northern European merchants from the Netherlands began to compete with Portugal and Spain as well. The Dutch refined their sugarcane farming techniques while occupying Brazil in the middle of the 17th century, and then went on to stake their own claim on the Caribbean sugarcane industry. By 1780, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or present-day Haiti, produced almost half the sugar eaten in Europe. British Jamaica, which is smaller than every US state except for Rhode Island and Delaware, was more valuable to Great Britain than all 13 US colonies combined. And while Spanish Cuba was slower to develop its sugar industry, by 1860, they produced almost 1/3 of all the sugar in the world. And these practices had already spread as France, Spain, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and other European powers started to conquer land in the Americas. Where there was colonization, sugar plantations weren't far behind. So, in the end, sugar production in the Mediterranean disappeared like cotton candy in the rain, but production in the Caribbean more than made up for it. All of this sugar production meant that there was more sugar available in the world. And because there was more available, the cost of it went down. But it wasn't so cheap just because there was more of it, it was also how it was now produced. Through slavery. We've talked about the Mediterranean and how Islamic caliphates and Venetians enslaved people to grow sugarcane in less than ideal climate. But when the Caribbean took over as the center of the sugarcane industry, it also became the center of the slave trade for the next 3 centuries. See, Portugal and Spain backed themselves into a corner when they set up sugar plantations on these uninhabited or decimated islands because no people means no workers to grow your sugarcane. And the workers they could hire, well, the thing with hiring people is that they generally have to be paid, and that would make sugar more expensive and less profitable for plantation owners. The solution the Spanish and Portuguese arrived at was slavery, and by solution, I mean horrific human rights violations. Unlike the Venetians, the Spanish and Portuguese couldn't bring in enslaved people from Russia and Eastern Europe because the Ottoman Empire physically stood in their way, and dealing with them was a hard pass. So instead, they traveled to West and Central Africa and smuggled enslaved African people back to the lands they had colonized. Now, as a quick aside, slavery in this era was common globally. China, India, and the Ottoman Empire all had forms of slavery. Serfdom was still in effect in parts of Europe, and African nations had their own systems where captured soldiers could be enslaved, or people crushed by debt could sell themselves or their families into slavery to clear their debts. What was different was the form of slavery Europe used here in the Atlantic. Other contemporary forms of slavery contained certain rights and protections for enslaved people. For instance, in the Middle East, Islamic law prohibited separating families or refusing medical care to anyone who was sick. At least on paper. The type of slavery used by Europeans was different. Under the system of chattel slavery, people could be bought and sold as property and were enslaved forever, as were their descendants. These enslaved people were treated as nothing more than animals or cargo and were considered disposable, to the point where enslavers often figured that a person only needed to live and work for them for 10 years to be worth the cost. So an entire human life reduced down to just a decade. As sugar plantations spread to the Caribbean, the colony of Saint-Domingue eventually imported around 40,000 enslaved people a year. And one reason was because the average life expectancy of an enslaved person there was only about 21 years. This horrific life expectancy was due to disease and the demanding nature of growing and harvesting sugarcane. But it was also because of mistreatment by plantation owners who forced enslaved people to work long hours with little rest and food. So, just as sugar plantations developed in the islands of the Atlantic, then transferred to the Americas, so did the slave trade itself. Really, the transatlantic slave trade was built off of the sugar plantation economy as a quick and dirty way to increase profits. For over 300 years, European merchants bought enslaved Africans along the western coast of Africa and transported them to plantations to save money on workers' pay and safe working conditions. Many enslaved people were forced to work in other industries, like mining and construction, but the number of people bought and sold into plantation slavery was astronomical. Between about 1500 and 1900, more than 12.5 million Africans were captured and sold into slavery. And because even just the conditions of the transatlantic journey itself were so terrible, less than 11 million actually made it to the Americas alive. The labor of these enslaved workers kept sugarcane cheap, which meant that more people could buy sugar and the plantation owners could make more profits that would strengthen European economies and later pay for the Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, the slave trade significantly harmed African civilizations, fueling warfare between empires and destroying local economies. All because of sugar and greed. The thing is, producing sugarcane doesn't have to be deadly. In this episode, we focused in on the period when sugar was synonymous with slavery. But for literally 10,000 years, that wasn't the case. These tragedies happened because of choices made by European merchants to put profit over people, all backed by their imperialist countries. First the Venetians, then the Portuguese, and later people from all over colonial Europe. The subjugation of enslaved Africans by white Europeans set the stage for not only the hundreds of years of the brutal slave trade, but also the racism that still exists now across Europe and the Americas. One thing about humanity is, we can get a little greedy. And while it might be okay to shovel your face full of Sour Patch Kids every once in a while, the greed and profit chasing of the sugarcane industry reshapes societies at an incredibly high human cost. And that's the bitter truth of history. If you're enjoying Study Hall Modern World History and are interested in taking an online course and earning college credit, go to gostudyhall.com or click on this button to learn more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.